everyone. This is Wes Henson, pastor of the Ridge Church. And the Ridge Church campus is located at 7350 Old Highway 13 in Carbondale, Illinois. And I want to thank you for joining me once again today for this week's small group Bible study for the week of September the 3rd, 2023 at the Ridge Church. We're starting a brand new study, and it's titled Staying True in a World Far from God. And so we're going to spend the next 6 weeks in the Old Testament book of Daniel. Well, we live in a culture that is becoming increasingly antagonistic toward those who follow Jesus. So, and through his actions and through his prayers, Daniel gives us a powerful example of what it's like to live unashamed in a culture that sees no need to live righteously or obediently for God's glory. And today, our study is titled, Week 1, it's titled, Develop Strong Convictions, and we're going to be in Daniel chapter 1. So if you check out the links, you'll discover a printed summary of this week's lesson, along with some other resources and handouts for this week's study. Then I invite you to join us on campus this Sunday morning at the Ridge Church at 9 a.m. as we go into detail. All right, so let's begin this week's on-the-go Bible study. Now, we have all assimilated to some degree to the culture in which we live, and our understanding, our customs, and our traditions all grow out of our culture. Now, that's not necessarily bad, but it becomes an issue when those customs and practices conflict with the biblical standards to which God calls us. Well, Daniel had convictions, and he lived out those convictions in a culture that called for a different standard. So here's some background of where we are in our study this week. So the Babylonians had defeated Egypt, and they had conquered all of the area, including Israel and the surrounding area, the area of Syria, Palestine. And the king of Israel rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. And that brought the Babylonian army against Jerusalem. And Nebuchadnezzar had conquered Judah and imposed a forced exile on some of the Jewish population. Well, Daniel and others from the nobility and the royalty were among those in the first wave of those being deported to Babylon, and that was in about 605 BC. Sometimes we look at our world today and we say, this is not the world that I have known. This is not the world that I grew up in. Something is vastly wrong here. Well, when Daniel was exiled and transported into Babylon, a foreign and ungodly place, his example can help instruct us how we too can live faithfully in seemingly an unfamiliar and increasingly an unfamiliar world. The point of our lesson this week, our study this week, is that our convictions, not our circumstances, define who we are. So we're in Daniel chapter 1. I'm going to begin reading verses 3 through 7. And I've got some names here that are kind of difficult to pronounce, so just kind of bear with me, if you will. Verse 3. So the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief eunuch, to bring some of the Israelites from the royal family and from the nobility, young men without any physical defect, good-looking, suitable for instruction in all wisdom, knowledgeable, perceptive, and capable of serving in the king's palace. And he was to teach them the Chaldean language, or the Babylonian language, and literature. And so the king assigned them daily provisions from the royal food and from the wine that he drank. And they were to be trained for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to attend to the king. So among them, from the Judaites were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief eunuch gave them names He gave them the name Belshazzar to Daniel, Shadrach to Hananiah, Meshach to Mishael, and Abednego to Azariah. So these Hebrew youths, Daniel and his friends, they're about 15 years old. Their experience in Babylon served for us a cautionary tale, if you will. As modern culture moves from traditions that honor God, increasingly the world will expect that people of faith would abandon their loyalty to God. They will pressure us to embrace lifestyles that violate the Word of God. And the question is, will we remain faithful like Daniel and his friends? So the world expects us to conform to its expectations, and in these next verses, we're going to see that we must draw the line where we will not compromise. Let me pick up in verse 8. So Daniel was determined that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. So he asked permission from the chief eunuch not to defile himself. And God granted Daniel kindness and compassion from the eunuch. And yet he said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and drink. What if he sees your faces looking thinner than the other young men your age? Well, then you would endanger my life with the king. So Daniel said to the guard, whom the chief eunuch had assigned to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. And then you can examine our appearance and the appearance of the young men who are eating the king's food, and deal with your servants based on what you see. So Daniel refused to eat the king's food because he thought it would defile him. Well, the reason why he thought it would defile him, a couple of reasons for possibilities. Daniel, having been raised in a Jewish home, would have understood that certain foods were not kosher and certain animals were clean and others were unclean. And we get that from Genesis chapter 7 about the kinds of food, the kinds of animals that the Jewish people were allowed to eat. And then secondly, ancient pagan religions often compelled their adherents to leave food before an idol. And after it had presented to the god or to the idol, the priest or the leader would then consume it. So when God gave the law to Moses, he prohibited the consumption of food offered to idols, and that concern was continued on even into the New Testament after some Jewish individuals had begun to follow Jesus. They were concerned about the kind of food they were to eat. You remember in Acts, Peter having that dream about what kinds of food were clean or unclean, and what kind he could touch and not touch, and what kind he could eat and not eat. And so that was a big deal. So if these young men had eaten from the king's table and afterwards appeared vigorous, alert, and robust, then their condition would be attributed to what the Babylonians had furnished. However, if they were in that same healthy condition after eating the minimized and modified diet, then the credit would have to be attributed to what God had done. And so that was the test that Daniel presented before his master. So in the next verses, we see that we are to serve and stand for the Lord no matter what the culture does. Verse 17, I'm going to run down to verse 17 through 19. So God gave these 4 young men knowledge and understanding and every kind of literature and wisdom. And Daniel also understood visions and dreams of every kind. And at the end of the time that the king had said to present them, the chief eunuch presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. And the king interviewed them, and among all of them no one was found equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they began to attend the king. So Daniel and his friends, just think about this, they had been taken captive from Israel. And certainly they had every reason to question God and to wonder why God had abandoned them in such a life-altering crisis. And we would have expected, or we would not have been surprised, if once they got to their new land, that they just didn't turn their backs on the Lord. But Daniel and his friends recognized that God was actively at work, even in their current threatening situation. And the force surpassed both the king's expectations and the other captives' abilities. And although Daniel had learned about the Babylonian culture and followed much of the culture, he refused to compromise in his faith and his faithfulness to God. You see, the Lord had not abandoned Daniel. He blessed both him and his friends. And Daniel wasn't where he planned to be, but he was right where God needed him to be. So that's our lesson for this week. And how can we take what we have read here about Daniel and apply it to our lives this coming week? Well, let me give you three applications. Number one, analyze your own life situation. You know, if God is working in an unexpected way, well, then pray and ask for God's wisdom to see the bigger picture of what he's doing in your life. Application number two, think about your own life. You know, is there an area in which you have compromised and you've adopted the world's unbiblical values? Well, then pray and ask the Lord for strength to know what to do in this situation. And then the third application is this: tell your story. Share with your family and your friends details of a time that God led you into an unexpected or even uncomfortable place or opportunity or situation, but you later saw the hand of God at work. Remember, our convictions, not our circumstances, define who we are. Okay, that's our lesson for this week, and if you check out the links, you'll discover a printed summary along with some resources and handouts that give some background as to what is going on in Babylon and what is going on with the people of Israel and their deportation and exile in Babylon. And you'll see all that for this week's study. And then I invite you to join us on campus this Sunday morning at 9 a.m. as we go into greater detail. Okay, bye for now.